Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NEANE lecture series. This initiative is the result of a collaboration between NEANE, Study Center for Non-European Arts at Unicamp, and the SMFA at Tufts University. And it has the support of the Getty Foundation through their Connecting Art History programs. Before my colleague Claudia presents the guest for tonight, I would just like to remind you that you can send your questions after the talk through the comment section on our YouTube channel, and we will pass it on to our guest and respond. So please, Claudia.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with Zoe. Thank you so much, Zoe, for being with us tonight. I think many of you already know Professor Zoe. She's been collaborating with us for some time now, but I will present her, of course, for those who still do not know her. Zoe Strudder is a professor of African art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University in New York. She is a specialist in the arts of Central and Western Africa with focus on 20th and 21st centuries. Her research centers on the relations between image and social imaginary throughout history and the representations of Africa in Europe. And she has published many books and articles, including the book Inventing Masks, Agency and History in the Art of the Central Penge, and most recently, Humor and Violence, Seeing Europeans in Central African Art from 1850 to 1997, which came out in 2016. So his lecture today will be on El Anatsui, the reluctant iconoclast. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to return to Unicamp a little bit. And this means I have many fond memories, and I really enjoyed collaborating with you, Claudia, and Patricia, and also Sabrina Mora, who's been a wonderful interlocutor for me. So everyone, because of a little glitch, we're going to have to advance the slides the old-fashioned way. So you'll hear me say next from time. So if we could progress to the first slide, please. Thank you. So in 2005, El Anatsui emerged as an artistic wonder on the international market. Institutions from Germany to Japan were vying for his shimmering metal cloth confections. At the time, I was trying to organize an exhibition for the Museum for African Art on ephemerality and iconoclasm, and was interested to learn about his work with, next please, a chainsaw. Surely here was an artist who saw himself as an iconoclast, even extolling the raw power of his chosen artistic implement in a poem. Slash, rip, sear, whittle, devastate, chip, chop, break, burn, weigh down, juxtapose, control. We invited El Anatsui to take part in the exhibition, which unfortunately didn't happen, and he answered immediately, writing that he'd be happy to participate because, quote, destruction, death, breakdown are prerequisites for new life, growth, and renewal. And yet when I arrived in Nigeria at the University of Nsukka and asked him, are you an iconoclast? He said no. It was visceral. He didn't take a minute to think about it. And today I want to explore this reaction because few artists of color, particularly in Africa, and very few women have been willing to appropriate the posture of the iconoclast, which has been so important in modern art history. Next, please. So to situate those of you outside art history, the term iconoclasm was coined in Byzantium to describe the breaking of images. However, by the 1790s, the meaning was extended to attacking venerated institutions and cherished beliefs. Many choose not to remember the scale of devastation unleashed during the French Revolution. For example, the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was defaced. In 1793, all of the biblical kings depicted high on the facade were beheaded And those heads were sold scornfully as building materials. Next. The guillotine used to execute Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and other aristocrats was erected on the site of the obliterated statue of Louis XV. Through these actions, the revolutionaries made clear their determination to reject the past and to institute a new form of secular government. As Peter Weibel has outlined, since the French Revolution, the breaking of images and destruction of idols has been linked to the rhetoric of progressive revolutionary politics, liberty, and enlightenment. Reason rather than superstition. The rhetoric of the revolutionary, of the iconoclast, is that violence is necessary in order to overturn the status quo. As contemporary scholarship has emphasized, the material object serves as a vehicle for the iconoclast in the breaking of meaning, or semioclasses. Next, please. Now, in the art world, the violence directed at the past is usually metaphorical, one might say psychological, and directed, as Dario Gamboni has shown, primarily at the conception of art itself. The exhibition Iconoclast brought together a phalanx of modern and contemporary artists working in an iconoclastic vein. There is not only Duchamp, who famously submitted a urinal to an art exhibition and a gesture of irreverence and disdain. There is Daniel Spore acting on Duchamp's instruction to use an old master like Rembrandt or Da Vinci as an ironing board. Armand attacked a reproduction of Dali's crucifixion with a hatchet, thereby freeing himself from the oppressive weight of both religion and art history. In this huge, sprawling exhibition, it was notable that very few modern or contemporary artists of color or women were represented. Is this another case of white metropolitan narcissism? Or is something more interesting going on? Next. It's a question worth asking because iconoclasm is highly rewarded practice in the art world, as evidenced by the career of Damien Hirst. In 1994, Hirst came to notoriety by exhibiting a sheep preserved in a vat of formaldehyde at the Serpentine Gallery. This action inspired a young artist named Mark Bridger to pour ink into the vat and to take ownership of the installation, which he renamed Black Sheep. Next. Not to be outdone, Hirst designed a pull-out tab in one of his catalogs so that you, the reader, can enjoy the thrill of the iconoclast pouring ink into the installation to obliterate the sheep. Next. Hirst even appropriated Bridger's title, Black Sheep, provoking Bridger to countersue for copyright infringement. My point is that these gestures of disdain for the past have real market implications. Thanks to these escapades, Damien Hirst has been the richest artist in the UK for many years, and some think the world. Now, in such an environment, what might account for Anatsui recoiling from the label of the iconoclast? Next, please. Now, often when I teach, I encourage students to think about the different art worlds to which artists, critics, art historians may belong. Howard Becker argues that the artist thus works in the center of a network of cooperating people, all of whose work is essential to the final outcome. He would be happy if we compiled a list of names like the one you see at the end of films, which cite the first grip, the makeup artists, and the costume people, etc. He asks us to think about the entire world necessary in order to make a successful work of art. And so in the visual arts, that would include the educational process, which by its scope makes possible a manufacturing process for the production of tubed paint and primed canvas. He includes critics who advocate for and interpret works, and curators who put them in dialogue with other works. There's the prestige associated with certain collectors, etc. So don't be overwhelmed by my diagram. It's a roadmap of some of the places we're going. I just wanted you to help you visualize the three primary art worlds that we have to engage in order to understand the creativity of Anatsui. Now, importantly, he was educated in the College of Art and the University of Technology in Kumasi in Ghana. He graduated in 1968, and by his own description, the Ghanaian economy was shattered. It was hopeless. It's doing much better today. But at that time, it was a low point in Ghanaian history. And so he was very lucky to be invited in 1975 to be a professor of sculpture at the University of Nsukka in Nigeria. Now, what you have to understand is that this was only 5 years after the end of the Biafran Civil War, and Nsukka was located in the heartland of the rebellion. In fact, Chinua Achebe, an author you may know, and Uche Okeke, a very important artist and head of the department at the university, had both worked for the Biafran secessionist state. The Igbo were prime movers in wanting to secede following pogroms directed against the Igbo people, largely by Northerners. Over 1 million people died, including 400,000 children below the age of 10. Anatsui was coming into a devastated area, much worse than Ghana, but it was a moment nonetheless when Nsukka was energized by people saying, we are going to rebuild, we are going to make something out of this devastation. It was a very dynamic place. Next, please. So to give you a quick look at the map, if you look at the northern border there of the purple blob in the middle, you'll see Nsukka. The city is surrounded by a number of ethnic groups. Anatsui said that he was very much stimulated by the fact that Nsukka was not located in a gigantic city like Lagos. Instead, he found himself, as he put it, in the middle of an autochthonous community with ongoing African religious and artistic practices. And he liked to drive out in the communities, sit in the village squares, and absorb the compositional strategies and the palette of colors. He was very much stimulated by this amazing moment in Nsukka. Next. Nsukka had a first-class electric kiln for a short period in the 70s, and Anatsui was inspired by a playwright there who wrote a text called Broken Pots to think about the significance of pottery. You know, we tend to think of pottery as fragile, but archaeologists would tell you that it's the bedrock of all that we know about deep history, that potsherds seem to be practically immortal. And so in the ritual context in this part of the world, Anatsui was sensitized to notice that if you want to move something into the other world, you often make offerings by breaking the vessel. So here in this example, he's mimicking how people will try to repair their water vessels by sewing them together. And yet, the cracking or splitting of a vessel can serve as an omen of bad things to come. A wake-up call to pay attention. So Anatsui is celebrating the ephemerality of these pots, but at the same time, there's a certain contradiction. He's taking advantage of a state-of-the-art kiln to fire his ceramics at 1,100 degrees centigrade. If you ping them, it sounds like metal. But he was moved, as the playwright Onekwe said, to ponder that, quote, although a broken pot does not return to its original shape, it is not negated, it passes on to other levels of existence. And so these insights really resonate with the history of a reincarnation, which was the model for religious practice in this area. Next, please. So one of the artist's favorites in this series is Chambers of Memory. He sold it to a colleague, but was happy to buy it back when the colleague's new wife, a fellow university professor, criticized the work as a graven image of the type that's forbidden by the biblical second commandment. Now, Anatsui loved the idea that his work had enough impact to be castigated as a graven image. And it's striking that this series is so important to Anatsui's mission, his worldview, that he's tried to keep it together throughout his career. So Chambers of Memory is unusual in his oeuvre because of the figuration. One reason that he was attuned to ceramics is because Nigeria has a world-class collection of antiquities. He discovered Knox history in a local museum, which he describes as, quote, having some of the finest examples of authentic clay language in the world. And you can see that he references Knox visually, but shows it broken and damaged. He was thinking about both Nigeria and Ghana and how we live through periods of turmoil and devastation. He emphasizes that in the human condition, you will have loss, you will have seemingly arbitrary decisions made about what is preserved and what is forgotten, and you have to move forward. It's not a given that you're going to be able to rebuild and move towards a positive future unless you dedicate yourself to it. Next, please. So in this example, Way to Patchum, one of the ones that got away, collected by Chinua Achebe himself, and in Nigerian English, this means we patch it. The idea is that you do the best you can. It's like an African Sisyphus, that you take these potsherds and you put them together to make a new vessel, but it's going to leak. You can see the holes that he's mimicking here. During such a difficult period, he admits that he was fighting against pessimism and trying to move towards the future with this series. Next. So in 1980 to 2000, Anatsui entered a new phase with a growing reputation. And Nsuka remains pivotal. Importantly, there was a cadre of students who provided a critical apparatus for him. Not many African artists are so fortunate. He may, in fact, even be unique in this regard. You had Olo Agwibe, who wrote essential articles about his practice. Chika Okeke-Agulu, who curated a major retrospective with Okwi and Wazor in Munich in 2019. You have the new curator of MoMA in New York, Ugochukwu Smooth and Zewi. Really, it's an extraordinary group of students who are not scared by the politics in his work, nor by the intellectualism in his work. They take seriously sculpture, because all studied sculpture with him. Nonetheless, it's important to note that at this time, he was also able to take some time abroad in artist residencies. These tended to be small in scale, but they were crucial for him, according to his own account. At one in 1980 in Cummington, Massachusetts, he was the only visual artist in residence. He asked for a chainsaw to cut down some of their trees to use in his work, and it occurred to him that he could actually draw with a chainsaw. Next, please. With time, he experimented and gained control over it. He learned to aim the chainsaw straight down in order to treat it as a powerful pencil. You can see here these serpentine lines that he has gone back through and burned in with an acetylene torch. He used these lines to evoke the currents of the Niger River, which cuts through Igbo country and is essential for the life of trade in Nigeria. This is the thing about Anatsui. A lot of books will just talk about the mastery of the chainsaw, the beauty of the calligraphic line. But if you know about his predilection for politics, you can go up to him, as I was able to do at a lunch in 2013 in Brooklyn, and say, okay, what's the subtext? What is between Onitsha and Asaba? These are Igbo towns on either side of the Niger River. You can see them in silver on the top and the bottom of the composition. And I was thinking, there was a major iconoclastic event I knew about in 1898 when the British burned down a major shrine in Asaba. The Chika Okeke-Agulu was present and beat him to the punch, saying that it was Onitsha that was burned down in 1872. This was the period before official colonialism, and the people of Onitsha preferred to trade with French merchants. Consequently, the British blockaded the port, and the people in anger burned down some of the churches opened by missionaries. And that led to repercussions by the British. Once the colony was established, the British favored Onitsha. They sidelined, they favored Asaba and sidelined Onitsha. And as Chico Kekeagulu sums it up, what's between them? It points to the significance of trade on the Niger and the way that trade was introduced by the Royal Niger Company to Nigeria. Next, please. So I said to Elle, well, who's going to know that? Is that important for you? Do you want that history explained on your labels? And he said, no, it's okay. It's important that viewers will come to the subject with different backgrounds, and they will respond to it as they can. And if they can only respond aesthetically, that's okay. So he articulated this attitude in a seminal article, an interview with Oluwagwibe in 1993, in which he said that the art object is, as it were, the end of the artist's experience and the beginning of the audience's experience. Where the artist bids it goodbye, the audience bids it hello. The object is then the meeting ground between the artist and the audience. Now, he has very consistently held this attitude ever since the 90s. And he's voicing a perspective shared by Chinua Achebe and many of the intellectuals working at Nsukka. And it has a larger regional resonance. The literary critic Olabiyi Yai likes to quote a Yoruba proverb that the sculptor is supposed to voice when he sets down his adze, his carving tool, to say, "Here ends the work of the sculptor, let the critic start his own." So what he's translating as critic is a wordsmith. It's recognized that it should be an artist who is, in a sense, a sculptor of words. But please note the concern Anatsui has to cultivate the creativity of his audience. And as I said, this comprises an essential part of his practice that's sometimes a little difficult for us to wrestle with. Next, please. So even though Anatsui usually allows the audience latitude, even he will intervene and correct things when people go too far off the track. One of his most acclaimed works from this period is Erosion from 1992. It was the fruit from another important artist residency that he had in Rio de Janeiro. And I just cringed to see how the National Museum for African Art in Washington, D.C. displays it. This is where you should have posted his poem, /seer, will, destroy. You shouldn't have this tidy pile of chips grouped around the work. Next, please. You get a better sense of it from this photo showing him at work on it. First, he seared indigenous pictographs from the region, from several different peoples onto the log, and then he tore through it with his chainsaw. Because the summit was called Earth Summit, everyone wants to read this as an environmental statement. In this case, he pushed back to say that what was most concerned to him was the erosion of culture, the destruction, the arrogant, fast-paced, arbitrary destruction of rich interlocking cultures in Africa during the colonial period. And he feels that this process is continuing. It's why he likes working with the chainsaw, because it communicates the devastating speed, the hassling, rat-racing, hypertensive pace of present-day living. Nonetheless, as he rips through, tears, destroys parts of these logs, he says that he sometimes has to take a break. And it's possible not to feel a sympathy and empathy with the wood as an organic living material. He feels that it's very typical of African artists with whom he's worked in the region to have respect for life. You can't completely obliterate or overshadow your materials. you must work with them, even as you're moving them into a new stage in their existence. Next, please. So I don't know about you, but I love snooping in an artist's studio. This is what you would have seen in 2006. It's an important period because he had begun to collect found objects about 6 or 7 years before, and he hadn't figured out entirely what to do with them. You have old martyrs stored outside and upside down. On the bottom, there are printer's plates and piles of bottle caps. He said that he would often need years to figure out what to do with the materials. Next. He likes to think of his art giving a sociological profile for his environment. Nsuka is surrounded by distillery companies, so they have an abundance of used bottle caps left over from their recycling processes. He started to think about the design potential for these bottle caps. Now, I brought back some bottle tops from Nsuka, but I left them in a classroom. And the system is different in the US. You know, in the US, we have a filament, the security seal at the bottom that you have to twist, right, to open the top so that no one can put in poison. So you get an almost cap-like top. But in Nsuka, they organize it so you have 3 discrete parts that separate very easily. You have, as you can see, the round top, and then below it you have the security seal, that filament. And at the bottom you have a broad neckband such that if you stretch it out, it's about 3 inches. And so he's discovered myriad ways to work with these elements. For example, you can turn over the rounded sides and transform the circle into a square, as he does at the top. On the other hand, you can twist the security seals to form circles. You can sew them together with copper wire and form these blocks using the gold bands. Next, please. Now, he initially sewed them together himself, but it took days and days. And so now that these works have become popular, he uses teams, and he will direct them to make certain design units, as he calls them, organized by pattern or color. And this is really important. Artists who stay in Africa, such as Bruce Anabrakpea or Sherry Samba, have to find a way to give back to the community. They cannot just sit barricaded in a walled compound. And so Anatsui, who has chosen to remain in Africa, has art students and other members of the community help out. Everyone in the region knows the kinds of things that interest him. So if they have an old mortar, for example, they will come and sell it to him. And this creates a really good ambiance for his work. Next. So he'll experiment by laying out the design units on the floor into a composition. Over a period of days, he might modify the design or start again from scratch. Once he's happy with the arrangement, the different blocks come together. Next. And when he made his first one, he hung it in the living room, in the middle of the living room, and he was plucking at it and thinking about the possibilities when a colleague arrived, walked in the door and said, "Kente." Oh, next, please. And he went, "Ah, of course." Once you recognize it, the references in the early years to Kente cloth are quite obvious and serve the artist as an unconscious reference point for developing a design vocabulary. It's really unmistakable in a work like this. You have not only the sheen of lurex and rayon, which were popular at the time in Asante versions of the cloth, but also the Asante color palette of gold, red, and black. Once people saw this enchanting new composition with clear resonances to classical African art forms that they knew and loved, next please, his art world opened dramatically. And he was lucky because another workshop in 1999 in Wales led him to meet Martin Barlow from the Oriel Mostyn Gallery, who put together a very intelligent exhibition using Sylvester Ogbechi, yet another one of his students. and others who really knew what they're talking about. It's an excellent little catalog, and this circulated into 8 international venues. And whoosh! Anatsui began to receive much more attention. The British Museum made 2 major acquisitions that made references to Kente in their titles. Africanist curator Elisa Lagama bought another one in 2007 for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She appreciated these references for the African galleries. And in addition to the students trained at Nsukka, you now had Africanist scholars serving as critics, most of whom had worked with classical African art, but now embracing Anatsui and arranging for exhibitions at the Museum for African Art, for example. Susan Vogel wrote a major monograph in 2012, and so there was this major opening up of his practice on the world stage. And he was still getting an audience that was informed and respectful. But then in 2007, Robert Storr featured Anatsui at the Venice Biennale, and things changed dramatically. His price jumped from $50,000 to $400,000 and continued to rise, to put it in the crudest possible terms. Next. Now, Anatsui's metal claws were often installed very differently at each site. He received a friendly, intelligent exhibition at UCLA because you had at the Fowler Museum a huge collection of Kente, and a major scholar of Kente, Doran Ross, was the director. And you can see that they went all out in lighting to enhance the sense of billowing cloth. It's really hard to believe it's metal. You feel the sheen of their lurex. Everything about it was enhanced by the lighting. It was sensuous. It was a wonderful climax for the international exhibition series. Next, please. And what they understood at UCLA was not to treat the metal claws as if they were paintings. In Ghana, the textile is kinetic. It's seldom, if ever, displayed on the wall, except maybe at a wake. It's usually worn on formal occasions. You have the previous Asantehene, the Asante king on the left, who has an attendant who follows him and makes sure to bunch the fabric so that you see the designs abridged or opened up. They have a fluidity to them. On the right is a professor at a conference I attended, and I hope through the vehicle of the photo you can get some idea of how the cloth has tactile differentiation. You can feel the difference of cotton from silk thread, for example. It's never just a flat composition on the wall. Next, please. And next, to start the video. So many people have wanted to compare his metal claws to painting, but the artist is adamant about his commitment to sculpture. This is Dusasa at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's the second work that they purchased. And according to Anatsui, sculpture is a shaped form. Sculpture is about shaping. And anything you can shape is a sculptural medium. What he emphasizes is that he learned from African relief sculpture that you define the form on a flat plane by sheer use of texture. And look here, you can almost think that there's some gauzy diaphanous fabric in the middle of this, but what's actually the little security rings juxtaposed to mashed bottle tops that look like Chinese fortune cookies. So he uses these different strategies so that he's able to vary the cloth and the texture of the work. Next, please. Thank you. I was intrigued by the fact that he called these bottle tops and some of the other found objects that he works with his medium. And it began to occur to me that he didn't mean what I thought he meant. So I asked him in 2013, most people would describe bottle tops, tin cans, etc. as materials. But you say medium. Why? He thought this was extremely funny. He really liked this question. And he explained that you have to think of microbiology, where the medium is that which enables. A medium is an enabling environment which allows something to grow. It's not just the materials, but live media which form or cause ideas to grow. And so I was surprised. I looked up in the dictionary, and his meaning was the first. A surrounding environment in which something functions and thrives, the substance in which a specific organism lives and thrives. And the meaning we're most used to in art history departments is 8A and 8B, far down on the list. A specific kind of artistic technique or means of expression as determined by the materials, as in the medium of lithography. So thinking about that, how can bottle tops be a medium for ideas? The bottle tops were almost predestined, as they had the size of the original strip cloth for kente, which was 3 inches, like that pulled out horizontal band on the bottles. They had the color scheme that was popular in the Asante cloths. They were pliable, and the bottle tops were also predestined because they were named, often with something that resonates politically. It might be an electioneering slogan or a reference to UN peacekeepers. Just like the textiles, it can be very significant what the name is. So he said that when he asked himself, and what can I do with these bottle tops? The trigger was that he was holding one of them that was named black gold. Now in Texas, that would mean oil. But in Nigeria, black gold refers to enslaved, commodified human beings. And he was intrigued because, as he showed in his ceramic statue honoring Knock, he was pretty sure that the people citing this name didn't understand that history. Some things resonate, they continue, and we don't even understand why. There are gaps in our memories. Next, please. Oops. But let's get back to that question. Anatsui, are you an iconoclast? When I asked a second time in 2013, he exclaimed, no. African artists try to reclaim the past. And he feels that there's been too much loss of African heritage for him to adopt the European posture of kill the father. Instead, he emphasizes over and over, we construct out of destruction. When I said, well, in the art world, Picasso, Duchamp, Damien Hirst, all these artists have framed themselves as iconoclasts. He said that his formal art education had not gone as far as Duchamp, and they were told that Picasso was a hero who had appreciated African art. They were not told about this model of the iconoclast. Nonetheless, he always emphasizes, as I said, that destruction is a necessary condition for rebirth. Now, up to the present, most of the artists on the continent who accept the mantle of the iconoclast are South Africans. Consider Kendall Geers, who has stated categorically that the art of creation is by definition an art of destruction. So there's a certain overlap with Anatsui there. He began his career with an assault on the art world by throwing a brick through a display case, and even exploded in a controlled manner in the dead of night, a bomb in an art school exhibition space in 1999. In 2004, he declared, I am an iconoclast. I hate history. I tried to destroy history, but I know that history I am trying to destroy. When I quote other artists, here, Carl Andre, I am killing the father, saying that I am a product of history. Next. So as we move further from the fall of apartheid, his understanding of iconoclasm has continued to evolve, and he now defines it as a disruptive reading of power relations. He now counsels that destruction should be in equal balance with creation. He even maintains that iconoclasm need not be spectacular, as he calls it, Instead, he's interested in finding subtle and gentle means to subvert hierarchy. And the change of strategy reflects a change in subject matter. As a white South African, it behooved Gears to attack the power structures represented in white supremacist rule, but he needs to show more discretion in engaging the history of display of West and Central African sculpture. He has taken various approaches. In this case, he has tightly bound African sculptures that he has found in flea markets in the red and white chevron tape used in Europe and South Africa to signal danger. He loves the ambiguity. Do these figures need to be protected from us, or are they dangerous to us? The tape distorts their figures, but they are unharmed underneath, wrapped like mummies. In one installation, the maniacally precise presentation on cold metal shelves calls out museum storage practices, claiming to preserve objects for posterity, even as they render most of them invisible from view. Next, please. So his overarching metacritical statement on iconoclasm is captured by the poster that he made for his 2017 Afro-Punk exhibition. Gears took a distressed photo of the ivory depicting Idia, Queen Mother of the Edo, Kingdom of Benin, blinds her, and pierces her lips with a large red safety pin. Is she silenced? Or is she sporting a sign of punk glamour, surrounded as she is by razor wire in a design evoking a shield? Gears strips off the deadening crust of beauty and heritage from this masterpiece in the collection of the British Museum, and thereby restores a frisson of danger to the memory of a historical woman who was a fierce soldier. If African sculptures go to the museum to die, as Chris Marker famously stated, Gears finds that trashing the works brings them to life again by granting them contemporary relevance. Next, please. But what about gender? Is iconoclasm a performance of masculinity? As David Friedberg once asked in a different context. In the huge sprawling exhibition Iconoclast, there were very few women represented, and the sections devoted to modern and contemporary art. So in 2014, when I was at Unicampi, Roberto Conderu recommended that I visit Hosanna Paulino. Later, I admit to recoiling in horror from this series of works in which she uses thick black surgical thread to X out the eyes or mouths or throat of Afro-Brazilian women. Next. The brutality of the attack on women recalled millennia of revolutionaries gouging out the eyes and faces of unpopular figures, such as we witnessed for Saddam Hussein in 2003. Next. But these were ladies, not cruel dictators. Paulino explained that she was inspired by talking to her sister who works with victims of domestic violence. The artist transfers carefully composed studio portraits onto fabric and stretches it within an embroidery frame to evoke a home-like setting, which should be safe, affectionate. Instead, she wrote in an email, I sewed their mouths to show their lack of voice, their eyes to represent the difficulty they have to see themselves and their rights in the world. I sewed their throats to show anguish, and so on. What is unexpected and very powerful in these images is that Paulino is asking us to identify with the victims of violence rather than the perpetrator, the iconoclast. And I think this approach is characteristic of a number of female-gendered artists, such as Yoko Ono, who famously invited her audience to cut her clothes off her body in 1964. Now, when asked if Brazilian artists were interested in embracing the role of the iconoclast, Paulina was amused. She said that art making did not receive enough respect in Brazil and that artists could not afford to undermine it. She also quipped that, if anything, Brazilian artists were reverential of European heritage. Now, maybe as an Afro-Brazilian artist, she was being iconoclastic by turning away from marble to work with cloth and to take Betty Saar as an inspiration rather than some European artists. In addition, after some reflection, she said that she was, quote, uncomfortable being aggressive. And I found that very interesting because I found these images aggressive, but she has trouble owning that. Paulino adds a fascinating layer to our discussion of the relationship of iconoclasm to history and art history. You can only afford to tear down what was elevated in the first place. Like Anatsui, she acknowledges violence and loss, but is concerned to bring it to visibility. Next, please. Now, in the exhibition Iconoclast, Bruno Latour calls us to interrogate and evaluate what he calls the worship of iconoclasm. I quote, the worship of iconoclasm in our society. But it's interesting that since 2002, the term has continued to evolve, and it's become strikingly positive in many contexts. So, for example, this pop psychology book, in which a neuroscientist reveals how to think differently. And the author defines the iconoclast as a person who does something that others say can't be done. So let's keep that in mind in thinking about Anatsui. Next, please. To a great extent, he has gone beyond the references to Kente as he develops his sculptural medium to envelop his viewers, as he did in his Glee exhibitions. There's political content, as he was inspired by the futility in wall building from Togo to Berlin to Palestine, and we most certainly could add the United States to that list. However, he has also created an ever-changing, immersive environment that invites us to experience our relationships differently to each other and to different spaces. Next, please. So I was struck in 2013. I told him in the past he had spoken of free form, but he's changed his vocabulary. Now it's non-fixed form. What did that difference signify? And he said free form could mean more than I intend to say. Maybe it implies without form. I mean that it's not fixed. There's no one particular way of manifesting itself. And he insisted he didn't want to give form orientation. So there shouldn't be a discernible top or bottom. I'm seeking form which is not committed, therefore free, able to be used for anything. And the next year he elaborated again through an analogy to fabric. You can put it on the wall, you can squeeze it into a ball, you can drape it on the floor, anything. So I would exercise my right from the audience, as Anatsui would recognize, to say that in the sense of semioclasses, the understanding of iconoclasm as the breaking of meaning, Anatsui has busted open a new medium for sculpture. And therefore, in his outrageous originality, he most definitely is an iconoclast. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for this amazing talk. We are now open for questions while the audience writes them. Maybe Claudia would like to start commenting.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Zoe. I thought that was amazing. And of course, I was directly drawn by the little bit of narrative where he is in Brazil. dealing with, like indigenous sort of patterns. And I thought it was just fascinating, the process of building and destroying, and I was thinking, I don't know how much you know about these specific works and what he was working through with the indigenous representations. But I am very curious about that, specifically because I think one topic that is very little investigated because of the way we divide spaces and intellectual spaces are these connections between like the indigenous, violence and slavery, and the Afro descent and this violence and slavery, right? When we know, if you just look around the corner, that these things are very connected. So you were giving meaning to some of his previous works when you talk about that beautiful first piece with the Nile in the middle. And I was wondering if you could say something about this process that he was working through with the indigenous representations in Brazil.
One thing that is quite wonderful about the Asuka program that was put together by the artist Uche Okeke. I know there are a lot of Okekes in this story, but he put together a curriculum that Anatsui participated in, where every fine arts major has to write a thesis where they go out into the communities and work with, kind of an older history of image making, whether that's murals, and often it means actually they're drawn to work with women, I think because often the women were working in non-figurative modes, and that was easier to sink. It doesn't have some of the reservations that they have about figurative sculpture, pre-colonial history. And so one thing that they're all fascinated by was this area was known to have its own writing systems, or whether we call them ideographic or pictographic. And so in that log I showed from Rio de Janeiro, erosion, he first went through, which is kind of amazing, with the chainsaw, and put in really nonsensical, but a melange of pictographs from at least 3 different societies from that area, because it's been important to acknowledge that there was writing here. And then just shows the horrible destruction, so that was close to lost. I mean, a certain number of those symbols are retained and still used for body painting and so forth, but so much was lost. And it's really interesting, that tension about just that he keeps coming back to that term, the destruction. And yet he feels very much that his role is to make something transformative. And that's why for a long time he had to battle descriptions of his work as being kind of a recycling. And he detests that term, that he's not involved in recycling, that he is, producing something entirely new. And it was only when he really, I would be so crude to say, when he started to top $500,000, the people started to listen to him. And one thing I wanted to highlight in this talk is how an African artist gets into, survives, is framed within the international market. And I think with him, one thing that was really important is that he had this really gifted group of students who've gone on to be major curators and critics. And because of that program I was describing, where they all had to write senior theses, and no one else has that. But I think, yes, that embrace of indigeneity, that's been very important to him. At the same time that he doesn't want to reproduce the arts of the past. And he's even gotten impatient with people explaining that history of connection with Kente, although it's undeniable he himself has acknowledged it, but it's gotten a bit tiresome for him that people want to stop with that.
Okay, we have a question from Sabrina. Thanks so much for your talk. Would you say that maybe naming iconoclasm as such would be understood as a taboo in face of the place African art occupies in the field of art history? I'm asking this because of how this concept has also been framed by debates on restitution, etc.
Well, you know, African art history, in many ways, really takes off in the United States during the Civil Rights era, and it coincided with the Cold War, and so there was actually money available for long field stays and for language learning, more than is true now. And so, because it was connected with the Civil Rights era, there was an important drive to be very celebratory and to combat, you know, a century of foul, demeaning representations. So in that, with that drive, it became very uncomfortable for people to acknowledge that, like anywhere else in the world, you know, there have been questions, debates, rejections of art practices, that sometimes figuration raises questions, that sculpture itself can raise questions, as you would find in any part of the world. Instead, it was, I think African art history succeeded too much in creating this artistic utopia, if you were, where the image was worshipped, where it was sacred, that no one ever had any political disagreements or rejections. And this was just beginning. That, I think, has been a real issue with outsiders writing on African art. And so actually, when I started getting interested in iconoclasm in Africa, I admit that I was partly wanting to bring African art into the broader history of art by showing that it had some of these issues. But then the latest, chapter in the restitution debate burst out, and it then became very awkward, and it can seem politically reactionary to talk about the debates, the internal debates about art making that have a long history on the African continent. So it's been kind of an awkward moment. So this isn't, I think, at all at play for how Anatsui is thinking through these issues. But it is at play for how people address classical African art, most definitely, right now.
Thank you. And I have a question as well, if I may. You mentioned in the beginning that when describing the artist and his work, that he didn't do your typical African art or your typical African motifs. And it resonated with me when you mentioned that at the moment that he started working on those metallic fabrics, textiles, and because it was a recognizable pattern from a traditional, typical African art, that was the boom, like the part of the reason for the boom. And how do you see his, or how does he himself sees this always condition that you have to somehow connect to traditional or what the West sees as a traditional, typical African art to be able to be recognized or to become famous or influential in the contemporary market? I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
It's extremely frustrating. And it's fascinating, for people who really wanted to know what was going on in terms of contemporary art practice. Everyone knew about Anatsui for at least 20 years, but his work in wood just did not take off. It did not appeal to people. And so that's why I keep going back to the critics, that you have to find someone who can frame and the work in such a way. So with him, ironically, it was the misunderstanding with painting. As I said, there were the africanist curators who were like, "Oh, great, we can, add some color to our classical gallery." My funny example, really, sometimes what happened. But then, but these critics like Olo Gribe, he was so important and really able to articulate an intellectual program and able to say that, wait a minute, politics is very important to me. And they were able to keep at it. And, from time to time, African artists will speak. I mean, I've certainly heard this in DR Congo. They'll speak about how they need critics. And there's even been a push during the Lumumbashi Biennale that it needs to, a consideration that there needs to be a push for funding to help train young people to become critics, to give feedback and to engage in a way that could be quite different potentially from what you find in the US or Europe. And that's just, I think, really essential. But interestingly, with the metal cloths, I mean, as I said, the Africanist curators fell with love on them. But something about the fact that they could be mistaken as kind of relating to literally a very common thing for a while is that people said that he was somehow looking at Gustav Klimt, or Seurat, or and that actually that resemblance probably helped things. And Robert Storr picked him up, but then at the beginning was having real trouble taking it seriously at sculpture. He finally did acknowledge that it was quite a revolutionary reformulation of sculpture. But yeah, that kind of that dissonance that was in people's minds with painting helped and hurt him. I think helped him get into a lot of collections, but hurt him in terms of how he wanted his work to be considered.
Thank you so much. Well, yeah, Claudia. Sure, do. We still have time for one.
And reconcile your discourse about Rosana Paulino, which for me was like a real surprise. And
in what way?
No, because I never thought of her work as relating to iconoclasm at all. It's And I think my question is, it makes sense if you just like think of iconoclasm as in a literal sense of like sort of intervening or being aggressive towards the surface of the work, right? But it is kind of a sort of a new window into the concept, right? Do you agree with that? To say, because just because we are so used to those works being read, as you said, sort of expressing an internal sort of state of the figure represented, that it's externalized, but it's not like disrupting the representation of that figure, although it is intervening in a violent way into the material. You know what I mean? So I'm like, it's not even a question. It's just like, what is happening with the concept of iconoclasm when you call that iconoclasm? Just, do you sort of, you really understand it as like an intervention, a violent intervention in the material? That is how you see it. That's why you're...
Well, in that case, yes, but also it's just such, to me, having, looked through, read so much about this topic and seen so many images, those thick black, and and that you can feel, right, that the
needle, the
violence at which she's poking the fabric, and so that's what communicated to me as a viewer. So I was like, whoa. And the interesting thing is, I saw those after I had talked to her, where she had said, oh, in Brazil, we're not willing to take on this role, even though she played a little bit with the idea about, well, maybe if I orient myself towards sewing as opposed to marble, maybe that's a kind of metaphorical tradition. And then I saw those, and I was like, whoa, it just really, because one thing I feel needs to be emphasized about iconoclasm, and most scholars don't want to acknowledge this, it's about hurting. And sometimes it's like, I wish I could be represented, but I can't, so I'm going to bash this. But a lot of times it's about hurting the viewers, who are presumed to identify with the represented.
That's interesting.
That's true.
Feel sorrow that the aristocrat has had. I had to take out pictures from the French Revolution of bishops and aristocrats with their faces actually very carefully excised, so that you could see exactly their stations.
But no faces.
Frightened and worn and hurt anyone who might regret the changes overcoming them. And so that's what I find so then amazing about that series, is that instead of identifying with the iconoclast and rejecting this, that instead we identify with the victim. And as I said, I really put it out as a question. Women, she brought it up herself, saying she had trouble identifying with violence. Do women are we socialized often to, need to perform femininity as a renunciation of violence? And there's a wonderful story. It's probably a reaction to Damien Hirst, but Nick Hornby wrote an amazing story called Nipple Jesus in 2000. And he actually has, in the course of the story, a gallery guard. He's at first repulsed because this artist has made this kind of beautiful picture of Jesus, which when he goes forward, he realizes it's a collage of porno photos of women's breasts and crotches and things. So at first he's repulsed, and then he meets the artist, who's this charming young woman. And so he's commissioned to protect this collage made of nipples. And, you know, inevitably these protesters come and they destroy it. And so sad, and he's assured that the female artist will be sad, but she is radiant because that's what she wanted. And it turned out there's a hidden camera. And so she wanted to, and so that's the artwork, is the film of these protesters destroying nipple Jesus. Really, fascinating analysis of the art world, but it's also interesting in terms of gender that she herself can't, you know, do something violent with a hatchet, but she can kind of inspire men to do it. I mean, there's a very old, that's a very old gendered story. Anyway, yeah, I would just, I hope I hear, you know, back from people about, as they think about artists, female artists, and because, as I said, you know, it's still such a remunerative position in the art world. And a lot of people, if we don't problematize this, or if a lot of people feel they can't take that role, that actually has an impact on how their work's going to be perceived, you know, how it's framed.
Yeah. Thank you. That so many important and very amazing things new to me. Thank you.
Anyway, Hosanna would not accept that she's an iconoclast.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the work has its own life, right? Like,
okay.
But I love how that, you know, develops into this question of gender that has not been really explored in this together with this concept. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, Patrice.
No, funny. It's just that we are running out of time. But one last comment. It's just a comment. But if you want to comment on this comment, Zoe, feel free to do so. So Sabrina is saying, now jumping into some free associations on the examples you brought up, I just thought about Gada Amer's work.
I'll have to look into it. Thank you for the suggestion. I don't know enough about it or what Sabrina might be thinking about, but
okay.
I will look into it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's an Egyptian artist called Gada Amer or Amer. And so, yeah, she leaves this as a suggestion. So, Zoe, thank you so much for this evening. It was an amazing discussion and talk. And I thank you all that were following, our viewers that were following the debate. Stay tuned for our next lectures that are coming up. And see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to see you, and thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you.